Greetings and various assorted salutations. This is the Introduction to the Civil Rights Unit. This lecture will seek to introduce y'all to the basics of this unit of study. In the course itself, we're going to dive into much more details over specific events in a sort of timeline sense and look at who is involved, what groups are involved in this monumental moment in American history. But we're looking at parts of topic 16 in our textbook at the time of this recording. These are the terms list. It's quite a long list. I cover most of them in this little lecture, or at least kind of introduce them. I'd recommend looking them up later. This list may differ from the one in your notes that we use. But anyways, the central idea of the civil rights movement, particularly that of the later 1950s and into the 1960s, is a desire by various groups to enjoy the liberties and rights granted to all American citizens. African Americans particularly sought to enjoy the gains of the Civil War and the rights that were given with the 13th and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution. If you want a quick summary of the 13th and the 13th bans slavery, and then the 14th makes these freed individuals citizens of the United States and enjoy the same rights as any other citizen. So freed the slaves, gave them citizenship. And so naturally African Americans began seeking these rights in more detail. If you want a full listing of the Constitution, you can actually find a copy of it in the online textbook, if I recall correctly. So the first thing we're going to look at to kind of introduce things is why the late 1950s. Why did the Civil Rights Movement really take off? Because the Civil Rights Movement is a development. It took some time to really take off. And there were other civil rights movements, one right after the American Civil War, there's one in the Progressive Era, but why did it really take off in this time period? Let's look at the factors, some of the big ones at least. One of the big reasons is the Great Migration. Essentially, many African Americans moved out of the South for industrial jobs in the North and the American Midwest, Chicago area. And that really started moving them out of the Deep South and giving them more economic opportunities. And this really takes off during World War I, and it shows no sign of slowing. In fact, it accelerates during World War II, which leads us to our next factor. World War II, in addition to many African Americans moving up into these industrial areas and helping the American war machine churn out the necessary resources, some 700,000 African Americans answered the call and fought in World War II. And many of them came home feeling that if America could defend freedom and liberties abroad, well, why not have those at home too? The war showed that America needed all of its citizens, black, white, etc., to defend global democracy. And this kind of leads to the civil rights movement during World War II had the double V campaign, V standing for victory. African American civil rights leaders during the World War II claimed that by fighting in World War II, by doing industrial jobs in World War II, they would show that African Americans deserved the equality that they should already have by virtue of their skills and their necessity in helping America win the war. The other big reason, these are just some fun pictures. A lot of surrendered Germans, I believe, in that picture. The other reason is the 1950s economic boom. What happens here is many African Americans in the upper and middle class African Americans, socioeconomic status, they enjoyed a lot of the benefits of American prosperity in the 50s. More and more African Americans were getting into college, more were holding down high-paying industrial jobs, and on average, they were going up. Perhaps not as fast as the middle-class white Americans, but a number of them were going up. And especially their children, the African American children of these middle-class families, began looking at things and saying, well, we aren't really any different from these people. Why can't we enjoy more of the prosperity? Because if everybody's prospering, why can't we prosper more? And so these are the factors that kind of lead into setting the stage for why the civil rights is going to be particularly powerful in this time period. But we need to look at the obstacles that they're going to have to overcome. Segregation is a multifaceted issue that African Americans would have to take on. Very basically defined, segregation amounts to separation of groups, be it physical, cultural, societal, or legal, but we need to break it down a bit further. And in key terms, there are two types of racism. There is de jure segregation and de facto segregation. Now, de jure segregation is segregation by law. The way I remember it is jure sounds kind of like jury, and juries are used in legal trials. That's how I remember it anyways. And the prime example of this are the things called Jim Crow laws. And the goal of Jim Crow laws were to separate blacks and whites in everything from laundromats to bus seats to restaurants, and particularly a contentious issue early on is schools. And the idea behind the de jure segregation, the Jim Crow laws, was to create a legal barrier between the two groups. And the argument behind this is by keeping them separate, they wouldn't be able to mix and match and quote unquote corrupt each other, according to people who put in the Jim Crow laws. And so to kind of counter this, African Americans would need the federal government to outlaw and enforce the ban on things like Jim Crow laws. Because at the federal level, there weren't really a lot of blocks in place. The civil liberties were guaranteed by the 13th and 14th Amendment particularly. But at the state level and the community level, a lot of laws were de jure segregation. The other one, de facto segregation, it looks like I've got a few blank spots on here. The design timetables on these slideshows are really short. So I apologize, but there'll be more information posted in this if you go into the slides and look at them. But de facto segregation is segregation by cultural or societal means. It isn't really set by laws, but rather by practices and things that become norms. In the South and in many northern industrial cities, African Americans were frequently treated as second-class citizens, even when there was no law on said matter. But another example of de facto segregation is in neighborhoods. Often similar groups of people live in the same areas. These divisions can be caused by a number of different factors. Things like economics, the rich prefer to live around other rich people, racial status. Immigrants might collect into neighborhoods like Little Italy or in New York, or the various Chinatowns in various American cities. Or in some cases, religion. Catholics and Jews often had their own areas. But in the case of like Birmingham, for example, we'll talk about that a bit later, they didn't really have official segregation places, but there were places where people said, this race doesn't live here and this race doesn't live here, and that's how it is. And we'll talk about that a bit further down. Now, the tricky part about de facto segregation is to take it on, it requires individuals to take action and not practice it. What really helps weaken de facto segregation is tackling de jure segregation. By making it illegal, you can begin challenging cultural norms. Sometimes this breaks down naturally, like second and third generation immigrants will often wind up leaving their ethnic neighborhoods in pursuit of economic opportunities, or they'll marry outside their groups. But the point is like de facto segregation is a bit harder because it's cultural and societal practices. And the only way you can challenge those is by, challenging them at the individual level on a regular basis. But it really helps to get rid of the legal separations first. Okay. Next, we're going to look at the groups that enforce segregation and inequality. These are the groups that the civil rights movement would need to take on. Because, there were various peoples who benefited from the oppression of African Americans, and that's why civil rights was a struggle. There were many factions that sought to hold down African Americans because they saw it as a benefit to do so. And so we're going to look at some of those groups because, quite frankly, they're what make the civil rights movement a very dangerous time in America for many people. The first, most infamous, and probably best known group is the Ku Klux Klan, abbreviated KKK. This was a group that sought to preserve white Protestant superiority over others. In addition to hating African Americans, they disliked Catholics and Jews. The KKK is noted for using violence to get their way. Members of the Klan were known for lynching African Americans, beating up whites who supported African Americans, and carrying out actions of terrorism like bombings. This is an example of them trying to enforce de facto segregation. There was a certain area in Birmingham, Alabama, where blacks lived on one side, whites lived on the other side, and some African Americans began challenging that and moving into a particular neighborhood, and the Klan got fed up with it and started, well, setting off explosives. One of the most infamous incidents that you'll hear about in this class is the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. But, in fact, Birmingham, Alabama got nicknamed Bombingham, because there were over 40-plus bombings carried out by the KKK members and supporters in the 1960s. A terrorist group, to put it mildly. Another group that was in there is the Citizens Council. This was a group of white supremacists that they didn't necessarily use violence, but they used law. They were formed in reaction to the Brown versus Board Supreme Court case, which we'll learn more about. And their goal, the Citizens Council's goal, was to try and create laws and regulations that would reinforce the Jim Crow laws and strengthen segregation and limit African Americans from voting. They were a major group to overcome because you couldn't easily label them as terrorists because they weren't throwing bombs around. But they were doing some pretty nasty things. The last group, probably one of the most threatening groups, perhaps not in violence terms, but in the people who set the system up, are Southern Democrats. Southern Democrats are a very different group from the modern-day political organization. The Southern Democrats reemerged after Reconstruction, which was after the Civil War, and the Southern Democrats held power in the South through voter suppression. They put on poll taxes, fees for voting, literacy tests, which were very, 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 very hard tests you had to pass in order to get the privilege of voting. I think that's what they call it. And there were other methods. And the goal of these practices was to make sure that whites could vote, and almost all African Americans could not. Some upper middle class African Americans could afford the poll tax, or they could pass the literacy tests, which is quite impressive. I've taken one of those literacy tests and I failed it. Bad. They're hard. Sometime I'll try and post one of them in the course resources, but they're really hard. Now, how some people got around, how some of the whites who were not very smart or not very rich got around it, is there were special rules that allowed them to be exempt from these tests or taxes. Usually there was something called grandfather clauses that were used as a loophole to make sure that, the Southern Democrats got their white vote at all costs. And so the Southern Democrats are the biggest legal threat to African Americans because they created the Jim Crow South they made the Jim Crow laws, they blocked civil rights laws at the national level, and additionally they controlled a large block of votes, and most presidents, if they wanted to stay in power, they had to humor the Southern Democrats, and so a lot of civil rights actions before the civil rights movement were kind of blocked by this vague threat of the Southern Democrats always there in the background. These are the states that they mostly controlled, the rough approximation. But So now we're going to look at the civil rights groups that worked for African Americans, but we're going to focus more on where they came from. You'll get into the actual groups themselves and the activities in this class. But where many African American civil rights groups came from was out of religion. While some used religion as a justification for mistreatment, more and more used religion as a reason for treating people equally. But to get into a few specifics, African American faith communities, due to segregation in the South, African Americans often had to set up their own churches. But as a result, pastors like Martin Luther King Jr. Were often some of the most educated African Americans in the South, and thanks to the Church Community Foundation, they had a leadership base and a group of people already gathering to work towards civil rights. And this isn't exclusive to Christian churches either. There were Islamic groups and Christian churches, and that served as the organizers. The Catholic Church is also in there as well. They have a complicated history with civil rights in this era. As a whole, the Catholic Church opposed and opposes discrimination, but often in this time period, the local parts would seek to adhere to segregation policies. Perhaps not the most strictly as some places, but they were doing that nonetheless. And particularly in the South, Catholics were often a small group in most areas, and, well, the KKK didn't like them either, and they were heavily persecuted. But many individual Catholic priests, nuns, and white and black Catholics would play essential roles in the civil rights movement. American Jews are also a factor in there as well. A lot of historians like to note that that various American Jews helped fund African American civil rights groups like the NAACP. This was particularly due to religious belief in equality and the reasoning that if you could lessen discrimination against African Americans, you could create a cultural precedent for less discrimination against Jews. Because it's worth noting that the civil rights movement isn't just about African Americans. It's just that a lot of the biggest events of this era are centered around African Americans trying to secure their civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. Colleges. Colleges were another source of gathering people and organizing people for the civil rights movement. All black colleges, particularly, often had student organizations that helped them mobilize the economically middle and upper class African Americans, who, thanks to their education, these students knew that they were fully capable American citizens. And they wanted the rights that legally they had gained through the Civil War and those amendments I've mentioned before. Additionally, there were whites and other colleges that often organized support groups. While often in the North, these support groups would pool their resources and help with things like the Freedom Rides. These groups were considered to the civil rights movement important because it showed that equality was something that all Americans wanted to pursue, or at least they needed to convince all Americans to pursue it. But colleges were another good central organizing point for organizing young, highly motivated people. Granted, it wasn't the safest thing, as we'll learn with some of the activities that we're going to be seeing. But, you know, when you're fighting for something as big as civil rights, there's going to be a human cost to it. But we'll learn about that further along. Legal groups. Educated African Americans and whites who believed in equality saw the U.S. legal system as a way of bringing about equality. After all, Section 2 of Amendment 13 kind of states, if I recall correctly, that the U.S. government has the power to enforce the amendments. And so the NAACP, for example, is famous for basically, well, how do we put this? Organizing lawyers to help various African Americans get their cases to court, and if necessary, all the way up to the Supreme Court. And we will hear more about the NAACP and some of their famous Supreme Court cases in this unit. Another thing that really helped is there was a receptive Supreme Court. Headed by Earl Warren, justice appointed by the Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Warren Supreme Court, looked at civil rights cases often basing their decisions around the 13th and 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and this really helped. The advantage the Warren Court had versus Congress or, say, the presidents is the Southern Democrats had a much harder time kind of influencing who got into the court. And so the Warren Court took years to build up, but once it was together, it really started playing a major role in the legal aspect of the civil rights movement. There's a picture of them here. So this kind of is the unit introduction, looking at why was it this time period, what are the factors that African Americans are pursuing for civil rights, who is their opposition, and where are the groups coming from, and a bit on how they're moving about. Ultimately, the civil rights movement is going to take off and really keep going because private individuals, men, women, children, blacks and whites and others, all joined or supported groups like these in the civil rights movement. In the in-class activities, we'll dive into more details as to how these groups worked and some of the history that they made. There's a lot more to this, but that's just a short introduction. Until later.